The Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact will come to order. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of our witnesses and our members here. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today for this hearing entitled, quote, United States Standing in International Organizations. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record that are subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact our full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with remote committee proceedings of HRes 8, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Today, we'll examine America's standing in international organizations. This includes, first and foremost, the United Nations. It also includes others like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and regional organizations like the Organization for American States and the Inter-American Development Bank and other key multilateral institutions. These institutions' very existence are an American accomplishment, an enduring legacy of the international order that American policymakers built out of the ashes of World War II and hoped might prevent another destructive conflict. While the world has changed immensely since 1945, let us recognize that the UN and other international organizations have succeeded in their primary goal of avoiding a direct conflict between major powers. For 40 years, instead of fighting the Soviet Union and the North Atlantic or the Fulda Gap, we battled them in international organizations in the eyes of the world opinion. Crucially, the United States ultimately prevailed. Today, it seems too many of us take for granted that the Cold War did not turn hot, and policymakers have too often failed to communicate the importance of international organizations to maintaining peace around the world. Ironically, it has been the very success of international organizations that has allowed some to doubt their value. This attitude culminated with the Trump administration. Former President Trump's hostility towards multilateralism, international organizations, and even many of our allies is well known and has had dire consequences for United States leadership. At the heart of our hearing today will be this question: how can our nation recover its standing in international organizations after 4 years of unprecedented damage? The task of doing so is more essential than ever. From the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change to migration and the refugee crisis, the challenges our nation faces are global and will require global solutions. Former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said about NATO, quote, "If we did not have NATO today, we would need to create it." The same can be said about the United Nations and other international organizations. If we didn't have the UN today, we would need to create it. In this chaotic and challenging global moment, international organizations must be part of our approach. This is not to downplay the real flaws that many international organizations have. It's no secret that the very institutions which help define human rights have members who abuse them and are working to redefine the term human rights to meet their own ends. The actions of China and Russia have too often prevented the UN Security Council from being an effective body in addressing atrocities around the world, as we've seen again and again in Syria. These are real concerns with the United Nations and other international organizations, with Democrats and Republicans both making these arguments. Yet the solution cannot be for America to abandon them and cede control of them to our adversaries. As with the Cold War, the new era where the United States finds itself competing with China and Russia for influence makes international organizations a first-order issue. We must redouble our engagement and commitment to leadership. Wherever important global issues are being decided, America must have a seat at the table. Similarly, the United States must take up the battle of ideas in the court of global opinion. I commend President Biden for beginning that work, rejoining the World Health Organization, and restoring funding to key UN agencies are crucial, common sense moves that will increase American influence around the world. We here in Congress must continue that work and build a stronger foundation for American participation in international organizations. The stakes are simply too high for us to fail. With that, Ranking Member Malliotakis, please go ahead with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, for calling this important hearing. I look forward to working with you and the rest of the committee members to conduct important oversight of our engagement with the United Nations and other international organizations. The creation of the subcommittee comes at a pivotal time. In recent years, we have seen the post-World War II international order challenged as countries like China and Russia seek to rewrite the rules in ways that advance their nationalistic agendas and undermine state sovereignty in places like Ukraine and the South China Sea. At times, there have been voices advocating for withdrawal of the United States from the international stage. I can certainly understand their frustration with the abuse of the United Nations system by malign actors. As we saw in the early stages of COVID-19, international organizations are not perfect. The World Health Organization routinely parroted Chinese Communist Party talking points that conflict with statements made by our own experts. The WHO's medical advice during the pandemic has routinely lagged behind scientific consensus. As an example, the WHO did not recommend the use of masks for the general public until June 5th, 2020, 137 days after finally confirming that COVID-19 was spreading via human-to-human transmission. In comparison, the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention here in the United States recommended masks in early April of last year. Despite widespread evidence of the CCP suppressing the genomic sequence of the virus that causes COVID-19, arresting doctors and journalists and censoring social media discussions of the outbreak within China, Director General Tedros praised the CCP for its transparency and setting a new standard for outbreak response. The WHO's embrace of CCP propaganda directly impacted how Americans view the virus. Lawrence Gustin, a professor of global health law at Georgetown University, who also provides technical assistance to the WHO, said, "We were deceived, myself and other public health experts, based on what the World Health Organization and China were saying, reassured the public that this was not serious, that we could bring this under control. We are giving a false sense of assurance." However, I do not believe the correct response to these missteps by the WHO's is the United States to withdraw. The United Nations and international organizations more broadly are not perfect. They are consensus bodies that reflect the countries who engage with them. As such, I believe the only way the United States can push back against the behavior and fight for true reform is by having a seat at the table. At the same time, the U.S. engagement should be tempered and clear-eyed. Recently, President Biden announced that the United States will be rejoining the UN Human Rights Council and running for a seat on the council this fall. The UN Human Rights Council is a deeply flawed body with a terrible track record of protecting dictatorship and despots and covering up the crimes of the world's worst human rights abusers. Current members of the council include China, who is actively engaged in carrying out genocide against religious and ethnic majorities in Xinjiang; Russia, who has carried out nerve agent attacks on political opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny; and Venezuela, where Maduro-backed forces have killed more than 20,000 people for resistance to authority; and even countries like Cuba that have a horrible record, decades of oppression of its own people. Despite this, the Council has focused its efforts on persecuting Israel, the only country permanently featured on the Council's agenda as its own item. I appreciated the Secretary Blinken raised some of these issues publicly when he addressed the Council last month. However, I believe reforms to address these issues should be a prerequisite for the U.S. seeking election to the Council, not a hopeful goal left to be achieved sometime in the future. When the United States engages with the United Nations, its agencies, or other international organizations, we bring not only our values, but also our financial contributions. The U.S. accounts for roughly 1/4 of both the regular and peacekeeping budgets of the UN. Chairman Castro, I look forward to working with you to conduct rigorous oversight on U.S. engagement with the United Nations and other international organizations. We must be at the table, but we have a duty to the American taxpayer to ensure that our engagement with IOs is targeted, strategic, and maximizes the positive impact of the United States abroad. Again, I look forward to working with you and thank the witnesses for being here.
First, the Honorable Maria Ortero, former Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. And I'll also note a Latina trailblazer in American foreign policy, who was the first Latina Undersecretary at the State Department. Mr. Jordi Hannam, Executive Director of the Better World Campaign and a strong advocate for America's key role in the United Nations. Next, we have Ms. Gay J. McDougall, a senior fellow and distinguished scholar in residence at the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice, as well as the Center for Race, Law, and Justice at Fordham University School of Law, as well as the former vice chairperson of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And finally, Mr. Hugh Dugan, the former senior director for international organization affairs at the National Security Council, who was deeply involved in setting U.S. policy on issues during the last administration, the Trump administration. I want to thank each of you for being with us today to share your expertise and wisdom. And I'll now recognize each of the witnesses for 5 minutes. And without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. And I'll first call on Ms. Ortero for her testimony. Ms. Ortero, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Castro. And members of the committee, I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today in this very important subcommittee on the issue of international organizations. I believe that to protect American prosperity, security, and health, to promote our values around the world, and guard our national security, we must pursue mutually beneficial partnerships with nations. And one way is through the multilateral organizations. Let me suggest 3 categories of multilaterals. Those focus on development, in which member countries make contributions and are part of their governance. The World Bank and regional banks are an example. Those focused on the most vulnerable and exposed, refugees, populations in conflict areas, people that are trafficked, human rights defenders, women, and children. Many United Nations organizations fall into this category. And those whose member countries vote on specific issues, such as the Human Rights Council and the Organization on American States. My testimony focuses on the first category. Development multilaterals support economic growth, a foundational goal. In other countries, as at home, prosperity is the bedrock on which all other strengths depend. Multilaterals help countries grow their economies and invest in the well-being of their people. More prosperous, stable, better-run societies are less likely to fray and either export their problems outward or create persistent challenges for our country. Development multilaterals offer several comparative advantages. First, they invest in the private sectors and they fortify free market economies. Their structure facilitates their deep engagement with the private sector. Their financial arms, the IFC and the World Bank, IDB invest in the Inter-American Development Bank, channel billions of dollars in investment loans and guarantees to the private sector. Second, they leverage resources. In addition to members' contributions, multilaterals access billions of dollars on the global capital markets, which allow them to punch above their weight. Even the World Bank's IDA, which provides interest-free loans and grants to the poorest countries, issued its first IDA bond in 2017 and is raising billions of dollars from the capital markets to increase the funds going to the poorest countries. Growing these private sectors is firmly in line with our own interests. Our absence or lukewarm participation in multilateral organizations attracts other countries to fill that space. China has moved aggressively to provide long-term capital and uses its Belt and Road Initiative to increase its influence and to grow trade. When the US pulls back, China cheers. Third, social inequality is a priority for multilaterals. Creating opportunities for skills and jobs for the least advantaged, including women, improves their well-being and keeps them from seeking a better life outside their countries. I note that migration to our border comes from the poorest, the most fragile countries in Central America, which offer very few opportunities, a situation which is aggravated by the region's violence and corruption. And finally, multilaterals focus on urgent global issues and seek global solutions. Today's acute and pressing challenges are the COVID pandemic and climate change. The US can be part of a global response as we have been in the past. In closing, let me just draw briefly from my professional experience with multilaterals to illustrate their role. Tiny businesses known as microenterprises predominate in developing countries. Women selling vegetables and street food, carpenters, shoemakers, metal workers, fashioning their products with rudimentary tools and on their dirt floor workshops. These entrepreneurs need working capital for their business, but lacking collateral, they don't have access to bank loans. Loan sharks lend them 5 in the morning and collect 6 in the evening. In the 1980s and 1990s, my organization, Acción, and others experimented with making microenterprise loans and getting them repaid. We faced 2 challenges: meeting the high demand for capital among the poor and covering our costs of lending. We needed a sustainable model. We tested these innovations in several countries, and our efforts required financial support. Developing the right model took time. For more than 10 years, the Inter-American Development Bank provided Acción with grants and soft loans, which allowed these transformative experiments in Latin America to reach fruition. Today, with IDB support, and let me say with USAID support as well, we have built commercial microfinance banks around the world that make millions of loans to businesses, including women, and provide a safe place for people to keep their small savings. These banks finance their activities as banks normally do, without 1 penny of donor money. I sit on the board of Banco Sol, a microfinance bank in Bolivia, which today has over 1 million clients, borrowers, and savers in a country of 11 million people. Women in bowler hats and traditional indigenous dress enter through the bank's front door with confidence and dignity and with a smartphone in hand. Their increased income improves their lives, livelihood, and educates their children. The multilaterals have the tools, the patience, and the vision to contribute to this type of success. Our active participation in multilaterals not only aligns with our highest values, but also with our national interests. Standing by our funding commitments gives us a strong voice in allocating their considerable resources and in improving the quality of their performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Soltero, for your testimony. I'll now call on Mr. Hannum for his testimony. Please. Oh, looks like you're still muted there, Mr. Hannum. Yeah, Nick, I get confused by switching. There you go.
No, there we go. You'd think a year in I'd have it down. So I didn't. But anyway, thank you, Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Maliotakis, and members of the subcommittee for allowing me the opportunity to testify today. I work with the Better World Campaign, the advocacy arm of the United Nations Foundation, and I will use my time this morning to explain how U.S. standing in international organizations has suffered over the last 4 years and why engagement and funding for the UN is in our country's best interests. Let me frame this conversation around the 4 C's: credibility, competition, cooperation, COVID-19. For the first C, in President Biden's maiden foreign policy speech, he spoke of renewing our role in global institutions and reclaiming our credibility and moral authority. Over the last 4 years, the US downgraded its engagement with the UN system in several ways. This included underfunding, defunding, or outright withdrawing from UN agencies and activities. Of particular concern, we currently owe more than $1 billion for UN peacekeeping, which means we are underfunding troop-contributing countries like Bangladesh, Ghana, and Indonesia. These arrears have accrued over just the last 4 years. During her Senate confirmation hearing, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield stated, and I quote, "We need to pay our bills to have a seat at the table, and we need to make sure that we're there to push back on those who would have malign intentions at the UN," end quote. And certainly for many, malign intentions refer to China and Russia's actions. The reality is that both countries have used our massive arrears, our planned withdrawal from the WHO and Paris Agreement, to say that we are not interested in helping countries solve the complex transnational challenges that confront us all. These actions have contributed to the reputation of the United States plummeting to its lowest point in 20 years. With respect to China, even though its own record is checkered, to say the least, because they're investing more resources at the UN, engaging in UN bodies, active in bilateral development through initiatives like Belt and Road, their influence is rising in multilateral organizations. There's not been a takeover by any stretch, but our prior absence meant there was no effective counterweight. In fact, the Trump administration itself realized that its approach of withdrawal and withholding was not working when it appointed a special envoy to counter China's growing influence within international bodies. But it will take more than one person to fix the problem. In short, the opposite of withdrawal and withhold is engage and invest. This means no longer playing checkers while they play chess, i.e., we should increase support for the State Department and USAID, continue to rejoin key UN bodies that we walked away from, and it means paying our dues on time and paying back our arrears. Because if China and Russia are really the greatest threat to America today, as many members of this committee have stated, then our approach should follow suit, and we should counter them on every playing field that exists and marshal available resources. Of course, countering Russia and China at the UN will be most effective if the organization is fit for purpose. As former Secretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright noted, and I quote, "The failure to pay our old UN bills undermines our ability to recruit allies for the kind of structural reform that Congress demands," end quote. For example, in 2013, when we were in good standing, the U.S. worked with the UN and allies to create the Human Rights Upfront Initiative to ensure that all UN entities were prioritizing human rights in their field operations. It's one reason why the UN mobilized so quickly to protect civilians in South Sudan after the civil war broke out. But in 2018, China and Russia successfully lobbied a range of other countries to disband the initiative, using our absence and US budget cuts as a pretext. How is that in our interest to have it eliminated? Alternatively, we have seen the positive results when we work in collaboration with the UN, both in terms of management reform and in terms of realizing results on the ground. For example, in October, the UN World Food Program, headed by former South Carolina Governor David Beasley, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which I might add was the 12th time a UN entity has received the prestigious prize. Of course, the US is the most generous donor to WFP, but our contributions are also leveraged by other nations to tremendous effect. Cooperation will also be key in combating COVID-19. This can only be done in partnership with the international community and entities like the World Food Program and World Health Organization. As it stands, the WHO is at the center of a global cooperative effort to distribute COVID-19 vaccines equitably worldwide, which research has shown would, besides the global health and humanitarian rationale, benefit the US economically more than any other nation. As more vaccines become available, most of humanity will get it through efforts backed by the WHO and international partners. This is what will ultimately end the pandemic, and this is why investing in the UN is so essential. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Hannum. I'll now call on Ms. Gay McDougall for her testimony. Ms. McDougall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we all agree that this is a moment of great urgency, both in our country and worldwide, and that these are challenges that cannot be solved without active U.S. engagement in international institutions. I commend the Biden administration for re-engaging with the UN Human Rights Council and taking steps to repair our very badly frayed reputation in those bodies. After all, the work of promoting and protecting human rights is a uniquely American contribution to the United Nations, initiated by Eleanor Roosevelt. And while we have often failed to make it our overarching priority, the cause has rarely advanced without principled U.S. leadership. For more than 2 years, the United States has been absent from the Human Rights Council, and for an unprecedented period, there have been no American experts on the human rights treaty bodies. And we cannot afford to not be in those rooms or to not be at those tables. When the United States is present, important work can get done. One excellent example is the cross-regional joint statement on racism, led by the US and joined by 155 nations, which was submitted last week as part of the general debate during the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. Only US diplomacy could have achieved that broad consensus document on fighting racism. The US leverages its credibility most powerfully when it leads with honesty, humility, and commitment to principle. So as we re-engage with the UN's human rights systems, the US must be honest and transparent about the failures of our human rights enforcement here at home. To deny the obvious would be self-defeating. And with honesty, we must also be willing to submit to international scrutiny of our shortcomings in the same way that we seek to hold other countries accountable for their own failures. Without that mutual transparency and accountability, the UN's system to protect the rights of people around the world is made into a charade. Our UN ambassador displayed the impact of honesty so effectively last week in a speech to the United Nations General Assembly when she offered a moving personal reflection on her own life growing up in the segregated South and the deep structural racism that continues to undermine our democracy. When we lead with that kind of honesty and humility, as our ambassador did last week, we set a tone and example for other countries to follow. Further, the project of promotion and protection of human rights globally fails if it becomes merely another tool in the struggles of geopolitics. Human rights protection must be conducted in a safe space in which principles of objectivity, fairness, impartiality, truthfulness, and good faith dominate. These are principles that should be upheld by all of the stakeholders, saying that the United Nations today is under attack on many fronts. Too many governments, including the US, withhold or delay dues, leaving crucial UN offices crippled and unable to fulfill their missions. Too many governments attack the UN's independent human rights experts for exposing difficult truths and block the UN's institutions from addressing effectively the most desperate human rights institutions in the world today. But with the support of Congress and the Biden administration, I think there's an opportunity to safeguard these institutions for the survival of the United Nations. We can't afford to let the UN fail. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. McDougall, for your testimony. And our final witness, I'll now call on Mr. Hugh Dugan for his testimony. Mr. Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your invitation to appear before the subcommittee, which is a privilege. It's a distinct pleasure to see Gabe McDougall. I had the pleasure of serving as her campaign manager while a U.S. delegate to the UN. She was successfully elected to the UN Commission for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I held one of the longest tenures on the U.S. delegation to the UN, 26 years, followed by a professorship at Seton Hall University. I then resumed as acting special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, and most recently at the National Security Council as its senior director for international organization affairs. My career in this realm spans 6 presidencies, 11 U.S. ambassadors to the UN, and most importantly for today, 16 sessions of the House of Representatives. A highlight in my career was leading the UN reform program that brought together Senators Helms and Biden to fund our $1 billion U.S. arrears to the UN in the year 2000. It bears repeating for students of world affairs today what this subcommittee understands, that politics must end at the water's edge. Congress has much in common with an international organization. Both are membership-based, both seek to leverage their values into policies, and they appreciate the force multiplier effect of working together. The title of today's hearing is U.S. Standing in International Organizations. There, our goal is to stand with others to promote shared ideals and to stand out as an example in pursuit of shared interests through cooperation. Otherwise, the U.S. risks merely sitting, uncritically, expecting to be appreciated as some sort of diplomatic goodwill. If the U.S. is seen as indulging international bureaucrats, we will discover yet again that our pieces on the UN chessboard will not move themselves. In that game, each member state quietly calculates, does this international organization work? And secondly, does it work for us and our shared interests? Our adversaries have supersized their efforts not only to best us on issues, but to hijack the whole platform. Exhibit A, the World Health Organization, which is misnamed, frankly. Instead of world, read Chinese. Instead of health, read political. And as for organization, it took over 1 year to arrange a fact-finding trip to the Wuhan laboratory, while America produced 3 vaccines in warp speed time. Today, our look at U.S. standing should not merely give itself over to foreign judgments on the United States. Rather, it needs to flag that our standing is only as good as the knowledge, skills, and abilities of Team USA in current times. The fact is, our best game against eroding U.S. standing in international organizations is a strong U.S. team on the field, U.S. delegates, U.S. citizens in the secretariats, and in leadership positions such as the World Food Program. This team has to be guided by a dedicated DC policy leadership, all having each other's backs. Alternatively, any game plan merely to take down our opponents is woeful. Alarmingly, I come to report to you that America's talent bench for mastering international organization politics has never been thinner. It needs emergency recruitment, training, and 24/7 policy guidance, not for 1945, but for 2021. A major study on this issue will be released by the Center for Strategic and International Studies later this year. Regrettably, where I sit, the U.S. is abandoning leverage developed by the previous administration that had pressured for more accountability from UN programs in need of reform. An elaborate reform proposal shared widely by the U.S. with allies was ignored by WHO managers and apparently deep-sixed by the current administration. Also, a major review of the Human Rights Commission is on the UN agenda this year. Whether reform is only possible if the U.S. is a member was disproven over many previous years of our membership in most world organizations. We shall see what the administration plans, none of which has been put forward yet. Other policy reversals undertaken, such as resuming as a party to the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, likewise appear planless. The U.S. is serving this month as President of the Security Council, which would have provided every opportunity to set the agenda and work from the high ground. However, Vice President Harris last week opted to make her premiere at the UN for little more than a victory lap and a pep talk at the Commission on the Status of Women. March was a missed opportunity for a Nikki Haley moment at the UN, one of focusing on UN accountability instead of deleveraging hard-earned US momentum there. In recent years, the Chinese Communist Party has surmised the UN as a supersized World Trade Organization opportunity, ripe for China's plundering, hijacking, and reprogramming to its
Oh, Mr. Dugan, looks like we may have lost you. I hope it's, I'm assuming it's not just my internet. Let me see. We'll take about 10 seconds to see if we can get him back. There you go.
All right. Am I back?
You are, yes,
Yes,
please.
thank you. I'll resume and I'm almost finished. In recent years, the Chinese Communist Party has surmised the UN as a supersized World Trade Organization opportunity, ripe for China's plundering, hijacking, and reprogramming to its authoritarian hegemonic ambitions. Throughout, Beijing is remaining Beijing. The rest of us are learning to suffer. China is now opting for open hostility in its dialogue with us and others, as we saw this last weekend in Alaska. It is a wolf warrior diplomacy versus our UN ambassadors' self-styled gumbo diplomacy. Unless we strengthen our pot, is there any question who will be eating whose lunch in the UN cafeteria? In good form, the Biden administration has said it would continue a tough on China stance. So job one for the US mission to the UN is to organize like-minded states to face down the CCP's grab at the world order's dashboards and passwords. Another chore is the selection of the next UN Secretary General this year. A key test for candidates is managing the new moment of advancing authoritarianism upon the organization. The UN will need resilience to stem Russia's tactic to degrade and erode UN principles, and even stronger resolve to counter China's game plan to superimpose its interests over those of the UN Charter and eventually replace the spirit of openness with one of jealous authority. In closing, the US has promoted US values in force multiplying ways at the UN and other international organizations. By standing and not sitting in international organizations, the US must continue contributing to the liberal world order and further rise and champion others to defend it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dugan, for your testimony. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between majority and minority. And because it's a little harder to tell who's where on video, I may ask the staff to help me out. But I can only call on you if you're present with your video on. So I know that there are a few members who've had their video off. If y'all would please turn your video on now. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And so I will now start our round of questioning by recognizing myself. So, these issues that we've been talking about, and thank you everybody for your testimony. It was fascinating testimony from everyone. But the issues can seem sometimes arcane or esoteric, especially when we're discussing organizations that most people, including the American people, haven't heard of. And I'd like to ask you to give us an example, and I'll open it up to anyone. Give us an example of how international organizations have had a concrete effect on our foreign policy. If we can give Americans a concrete example of that. And so, for example, has the election of a Chinese national to lead the International Telecommunications Union affected global policy towards 5G, cybersecurity, or emerging technologies? I'd welcome other examples as well. I point that one out because we've been talking about how engaged the United States should be in these international organizations, whether we should vie for leadership positions, for example. And so does not being at the leadership table, not being the leader, does that make a concrete difference? I open it up to the panel.
May I speak, please?
Please.
Chairman, thank you very much for a very insightful question. Yes, it does matter who is in leadership positions throughout the organization, both among the delegations and certainly the leadership of the specialized agencies. As you rightly described, the ITU is critically involved with monitoring and establishing norms and standards of telecommunications. 5G is central to that. There is an entire professional community that looks at this too. The stakeholders throughout civil society are multiplying on this very issue. So while the ITU has a critical role to play, it must also learn how to involve all of these other non-state actors who have real skin in the game. So yes, leadership in these organizations is going to have to be more accommodating of not just member states' participation, but reaching out to the significant stakeholders and actors who in fact have a great deal of authority in these various functional areas such as the ITU. I would like to point out, as Jordy mentioned earlier, the World Food Program took the Nobel Prize this year, which is a remarkable accomplishment for its work on stemming hunger, especially the use of hunger in war situations. The United States has always been the leading contributor, over 40% of the budget of the World Food Program since its inception in 1960. And it's always had an American in its leadership position. The prior administration placed the current leader, David Helsley, there, and his efforts are what, for the most part, brought the attention of the Nobel Committee to recognize the World Food Program. So to a great extent, the Nobel Prize Committee was recognizing America's ongoing contribution to a systemic problem of food shortage and the use of food as a weapon in the world over generations, and U.S. leadership that comes to the organization. The U.S. has always looked at these organizations that work well, and when they work well, we work well with them. When they don't work well, as Major Steward, we have to take the lead among our member state colleagues to make.
Thank you, Mr. Dugan. Let me see if the other. I know some of the other panelists, I think, may want to chime in as well.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I could just say, I mean, you raise a great point on kind of specialized agencies, and this is a key area where we have seen China gaining influence. They now head 4 UN specialized agencies, and we head 1. And one can say quite confidently, Hugh brought up food, but one can say quite confidently that the head of the FAO is there because we were disengaged and not aligned with our allies. In addition, we know that a couple of years ago that because of cuts to the State Department, IO Bureau, that the number of people working on getting Americans at the UN was cut to 0. We had 5 and we went to 0. China makes a concerted effort to get their diplomats positions. So we need to be engaged. We certainly talked about the importance of paying arrears. And this year is incredibly important. There are 9 positions for the head of specialized agencies coming up this year, and 5 in the agency programs and funds. You talked about the World Food Program. It's a great example. But this is a key year for us to be engaged and demonstrated in a variety of different ways, as I talked about. But staffing up State Department, staffing up IO, and certainly supporting payment of our dues.
No, well, thank you. I've only got 20 seconds left. I don't know if Ms. McDougall or Ms. Otero wanted to chime in. Yeah.
I would just say quickly that from the perspective of multilateral organizations, they really are a continuum to our bilateral assistance and allow us to access the billions of dollars the multilateral agencies have in order to be able to influence the way that those resources are spent. China, as others have mentioned, is in there trying to influence these multilaterals as well and ensuring that those resources go for areas and for factors that increase their global power.
Thank you. Okay, y'all, I'm going to start the round of questions. Moving on from myself. We'll go to Ranking Member Maliataka, please.
Thank you, Chairman. There's so many questions I actually have, and I would love to speak at some point offline with those who are testifying today. But I want to focus my question on the UN Human Rights Council, since that is something that is imminent and going to be approaching us rather shortly. Is there somebody else speaking there?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing is, just like his father, he's a very important part of the dialogue. I served with his father in the House, and
Daryl, your microphone's on.
dedicated libertarians.
Can the staff mute Daryl's microphone? Right. I think you're clear.
Tell Daryl I'm taking a minute of his time. So, I just want to focus, since the United Nations is obviously, this is something that's imminent, and the president has already declared that he wants to re-enter the United Nations Human Rights Council. My concern is, obviously this is an organization that has given some of the worst offenders of human rights a platform, including Nicolas Maduro, who spoke at the very first meeting of the UN Human Rights Council. My question, I guess, is what could we be doing to try to push the narrative and push our agenda to try to ensure that we are spreading, freedom, democracy around the world? We want to protect human rights of these individuals, some of whom are member countries represented on the council. How can we use reentry as leverage? And what advice would you have to try to address some of these human rights violators?
If I may answer very much for the good question. As I mentioned in my statement, there is a scheduled review of the Human Rights Council this year. It's done every 5 years, and it's part of the establishment of the council. So the U.S. has an opportunity in the General Assembly, which is the world's parliament, to raise these issues in a very serious way with a look at holding HRC more accountable and perhaps passing resolutions to amend its means of doing business and going forward. Thank you.
One issue that I would raise related to the Human Rights Council would be when I was Under Secretary of State, I participated as a representative of the U.S. in the Human Rights Council. And I noted that even though that we have members in the Human Rights Council that are authoritarian and human rights violators, there are many other countries that are not. And we can form alliances. We can work closely with them. We can help channel the agenda that gets set. And we can diminish some of those issues that are counter to our beliefs. And that allows us to also have a way in which we can develop relationships with organizations and seek a mutual path with our leadership. And when I was there, I remember doing this very clearly on certain issues that kept coming up at the council for vote.
Yeah, if I can just get in a word here, I was on mute, I didn't realize that. I think that the first thing we do is be there. And be there with a sense of openness to hear all arguments and honesty, as I said in my testimony. But where else to form the kind of coalitions that can push back on authoritarian regimes? As I mentioned, this coalition that has just been formed by the Biden administration at the HRC of 155 governments. That's quite, record setting. So we got to be there. We've got to listen. We've got to form those coalitions, and we have more interference on the line. And good work can be done that way.
Thank you. I'm running out of time. At some point, Mr. Dugan, I'd love to speak to you about the WHO, and I'm also a Seton Hall grad, by the way, so I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Actually, ranking member, you want to take an extra minute because I know you got interrupted at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're going to take Daryl's time. That's right. Just Mr. Dugan, you mentioned the World Health Organization. I agree with your comments regarding that China has basically taken over this organization. Any other insight you could share with us on how we should be handling WHO going forward?
Unfortunately, we agreed to rejoin and are paying $200 million right now without establishing any consequences for bad behavior in the past. We've squandered just this last couple of weeks the opportunity and the leverage that was created by the previous administration, which in fact had put forward a very detailed reform proposal on what the WHO needed to do and publicized it widely among many of our allies, many of whom adopted it as if it were their own. Only to find the WHO ignoring it and giving us the cold shoulder throughout. So the administration gave the WHO plenty of notice and warning and incentive to come to the table. They did not. They, in fact, stalled by not even having a trip to Wuhan. I think what we need to do right now, not just as an organization, but with the pandemic, is to take our mind off of the focus on why this thing evolved where it did, and realize that the pandemic, the spread of the pandemic, is what we really need to address. There's no doubt that it spread from Wuhan, whether it originated in a lab or nearby. It's academic. It spread from Wuhan, and that is undeniable. And we need to trace that and get more accountability for that. Whether the WHO is the actor to do that, I think it's not shown itself capable, and we need to rally other resources in the world to do that for us. Thank you.
If I could just weigh in quickly here, I know there's not much time, but just because our organization does a lot with WHO, I would just like to say briefly that the WHO had made mistakes which they acknowledged. They welcome reform. There's an independent panel right now, but I do think it's clear to say there was not support for withdrawal. In fact, there was almost unanimous opposition to it. When it was announced, all the major public health associations were against the move. So was the Chamber of Commerce. Even the Heritage Foundation announced its opposition. Last July, Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing on WHO and pandemic preparedness. All four witnesses, the Republican choices and the Democratic choices, were unanimous in saying that the WHO's work was needed, of critical value, and there was no appetite for some alternative. Thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you. I'll go next to the vice chair of our committee, Ms. Sarah Jacobs.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I used to work in peacekeeping at the UN and at UNICEF, so I know the important work that the UN is doing, and I appreciate you talking about that with us today. Almost all of you mentioned in your testimony the need for reform, and while the UN is incredibly important, how important it is to make sure that we're reforming so that it can actually address the challenges that we're facing. And I wanted to ask you about that. I think we've seen recent gridlock at the UN, for instance, just recently in the situation in Tigray. And it's become pretty difficult to envision the UN Security Council really being able to play the kind of constructive role in responding and mediating to conflict that I think we all envisioned it to be. And so I think as we're in this new moment of US global engagement, how can we seize on it for reform and maybe even move away from the traditional UN Security Council framework, which as presently constructed, obviously has not done what we need it to in Tigray or in Sudan, or even in helping mediate dialogue in Syria and Afghanistan. And I'd open it to any of the panelists for thoughts on that.
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for the question, and I would say a couple things just in terms of reform. One, I do think it's important to say that the Secretary General, one of the reasons he kind of was chosen is that he has a track record on reform at UNHCR and made some real significant changes in terms of moving more operations into the field, reducing costs. Under his leadership, they've achieved gender parity, issued new whistleblower protections, pushed for annual budgets. And so he's made a couple of key reforms. I think it's also important to show that the record shows that when the U.S. Is engaged, and that means kind of being a member in good standing, paying our dues, that we're much more able to achieve significant reforms. And I kind of talked about what former U.S. UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright noted. But peacekeeping is a great example. A few years ago, when the U.S. Was engaged, this was during the Obama administration, but they made real important changes in terms of field capabilities, ensuring that the missions would move more quickly, and also reducing costs, bringing the cost per peacekeeper down by 18%, for example. But that was a time when we were fully engaged and paying up. And in general, I think we're more likely to see significant changes. Human rights is another perfect example. This is a clear case where the U.S. absence, China and Russia are pushing a very different narrative. And so we need to be engaged. We need to be at the table, and then much more likely to advance our interests. Thanks.
May I also venture an answer on reform? I think, as I mentioned in my statement, we need to reform our own capacity to manage, and we need to reform our bench of talent. We need to build expertise within the U.S. government on UN matters. Over my 26 years or so at the mission, I noticed a decline every year in our expertise, and it's not owned by any political party or personality. It's just a fact of life that we have not invested in how to manage effectively in multilateral organizations. It may be a function of our American reluctance to participate altogether in foreign matters of these sorts, as George Washington warned us when he spoke. But the fact is that we need to invest in manpower that is not up there for 6 months or 2 years at a time and treats it as a trip abroad. The the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov served 3 separate postings at New York in various stages of his career, up to ambassador, and now he's the foreign minister. That is true in many cases around the world where diplomats go on to become ministers, or they cycle out into other more important posts, and they have a keen understanding, a working ability about the UN's properties and processes and politics. And our country has never invested in it that way. The State Department culture has never rewarded a multilateral officer's career development. It's seen as a place that was secondary, and we need to change our culture and invest in our manpower.
Thank you. And my time's almost expired.
And if I can, sorry.
Please, quickly. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
If I can, I think it is really critical that the State Department and all of our faces abroad represent who we are as a nation in terms of all of our diversity. And I think that also highly improves our ability to function in very diverse circumstances and with what is a very diverse world, and to learn to set policies that are credible in those interactions. I know that there is a report, the Truman Report is about to come out on diversifying the personnel in the State Department and upgrading the training, et cetera. But I think that's a critical point. And again, I bring us back to our new ambassador to the UN in New York, and what is going to be her incredible ability to negotiate through many, not just cultures, but the political values of different people around the world in a way that makes her even more effective than she would have been elsewhere.
Thank you. And I'll note our chair was a big part of that report and diversifying this department.
Yes.
I'll give him credit for that since it took extra time.
Thank y'all. All right. Let's go to Ms. Tenney.
Thank
for
you,
her
Mr.
question.
Chairman. Thank you. It's an honor to serve with you, and thank you again for your work and with me in helping the Rohingya people in Myanmar and Burma a couple Congresses ago, we did a special orders, and I'm grateful to you for continuing to recognize that terrible situation. I have a district that is home to 4,000 Burmese refugees who are very active in the terrible situation going on in Burma with the military coup. So I thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank the ranking member for her questions. I think they're vitally important to talk about the Human Rights Council and why the Biden administration did not leverage its ability to get back in the council by helping us in the American side. And also thank you to the witnesses for your service and for being here in this important meeting. I guess a couple of questions have been addressed. I'd like to talk a little bit, maybe Mr. Dugan, since you have so much broad experience, and I do appreciate your comments. I was a former employee with the Yugoslav consulate, which existed many years ago. I worked a lot with the mission to the UN through Yugoslavia. And so I got to see firsthand just how it works from another perspective, since I worked for a foreign consulate. But I just have a question about the value of the UN and how you view it. I mean, is, in your opinion, the United Nations a values neutral institution, or does it, or should it stand for things like freedom and human rights? And do you believe China's growth poses a direct threat to the rules-based liberal order that underpins the UN system? And if you could comment on that, I'd really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and for your very thoughtful question. Yes, when we talk about UN reform, thankfully nobody talks about reforming the UN Charter. It stands as a model of principle, of purpose, of respect for freedom around the world, and for the promotion of prosperity, peace and security, and human rights. So thankfully, the core principles of the UN are not in question. It's the manipulation of those principles, which we have to worry about. And once again, China has invested enormously since about 15 or 20 years now in the UN. It always ignored the UN. It was afraid of the UN buying in too much and then having to let the UN into China to look at some of the things that China does that it does not want the world to see. So it's always very against any type of intervention. And even though the intervention would reveal things such as you found with the Burmese situation, abuse of human rights, etc. So it's the manipulation of the charter, of the organization, and I'm afraid almost the hijacking of the moral authority of this organization branded by China going forward that is of most concern to me. So again, we need to develop our skill set. We need to be as bright and as hardworking and take the advantages that are due us up there. Congress has a special role in managing oversight and in UN budget matters, since we are still the major contributor. Thank you.
Would you say that because, well, and toward that, the UN specialized agencies, the United States, Britain, and France combined only lead 4, yet China, the Chinese Communist Party, actually leads 4 itself. And would you say that's a result of manipulation in the UN, or is that something that they achieved, by some kind of democratic principle to get there in that position?
Well, to be brief, they play by the rules, and they play very well and very hard. As I said, they really didn't give the UN much notion until about 15 or 20 years ago. So they've grown into their skin. They have an appropriate role. They're a large country. They make a big contribution. They represent millions and billions of people. So yes, they are playing the game better and harder than we are. Fairly, yes, by the letter, but not by the spirit.
Well, what would you suggest we do as a nation sorry about that, I lost you. What would you say we do as a nation to combat that and to get in the game and to be the leader, since we are supposed to be the beacon of freedom around the world, to hold that order? What was your suggestion? I only have 40 seconds left, but I know Ms. McDougall wants to comment, but it's up to the chairman. So please comment if you will. Thank you.
Well, I take I'm sorry.
I'd love to hear from you both. It's up to the chairman.
Please go ahead, both of you.
Go ahead, Mr. Dugan.
Oh, I just wanted to say that the previous administration established an office in the State Department called UN Integrity, which has the writ of trying to address exactly what you're describing. It's an office. It needs to be a bureau, and perhaps soon a department in the U.S. government. We need to develop more resources and expertise, as I've mentioned a few times now, to quell the onslaught of authoritarian overtake of our liberal international order.
Thank you. Ms. McDougall, I
Yeah,
think you've got a few minutes.
I would just say that in terms of the human rights area, yes, there are governments that have consistently put forward their views about human rights being culturally based and relative to various issues and places in our politics, but they have always consistently been pushed back on those views by human rights bodies and individuals. And to the extent that there is concern about China and what violations of human rights have been done in Wuhan, in Xinjiang, to the Uyghur community. It's the CERD, the committee that I sat on, that called that out, if you will, on the international stage and started the global publicity about it and condemnation about it. So there's as much pushback as there is, positions being continuously put forward from their point of view. What we got to maintain is that we've got a principled pushback that is, in those rooms, sitting in those seats.
So you agree that with Mr. Dugan that we could have an experienced, dedicated institutional voice in there to make sure that China is held accountable on human rights and other issues?
Absolutely. In this particular case, Mr. Dugan helped to run the campaign that got me that voice in that room, in that seat, to call China out about what was happening to the Uyghurs.
Thank you so much. I know my time has expired. I really appreciate all of you.
And Ms. Otero had something she wanted to add, and we've got a little bit of time here because
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a very brief addition to this. I think it's really important to recognize that China is making the case that their system works better than a democratic system that's based on a market economy. This is enormously important. They are being vocal about that, and it is basically an argument that they're putting before the world and that they are using through agencies like the UN. Our role is to be at that table and to argue that our system, our democratic values, the values of the United Nations Charter are the ones that we must uphold. And this is an issue that spans many countries in the world. And so our effort to be able to form those alliances and create those coalitions and create what you would call situations of strength within the UN is one way in which we can really push back in not only a crucial way, but I would even say in an urgent way.
Thank you. Great. I appreciate that.
All right. Representative Tenney asked the most popular question.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to go now to Representative Houlihan.
Thank you, Chairman. And my question is actually for Ms. Otero and Mr. Hannum. I'm going to bring us back to 2017 when the United States cut off funding for the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, which of course supports reproductive health for women and girls around the world, along with implementing programs to help prevent child marriage, gender-based violence programs, female genital mutilation. I was hoping, and if we could start with Ms. Otero, if you could help describe the impact that this has had on the UNFPA and its ability to protect the health of women and girls around the world, as well as against fighting practices like female genital mutilation and child marriage.
Thank you for that question, a very important one, and one that I have worked in personally in my career. There is no question that the UNFPA works on the ground, helping create the capacity of even the traditional birth attendants in Africa to be able to deliver maternal health, to deliver the kind of support that children need in countries where malnutrition and lack of access to health is so prevalent. If our commitment is really to help those vulnerable population, especially women, and especially address women's not only health, but also their ability, because they are in good health, to be able to be educated and to be able to participate in their societies, then we really are not living up to the values that we propose. There is no question that some of the practices that are imposed on young girls and on women, like genital mutilation, are factors that more and more countries are seeing as very problematic and very unacceptable. And it is through these institutions that we are able to move those arguments forward, to instruct people, to help educate. So cutting those resources directly affects the way in which women around the world live, especially those that are among the poorest in the planet.
Thank you, Ms. Otero. Mr. Hannum, would you be able to add any more color to this?
Let me just make three quick points. One, I think it's important just to again stress, as you noted, that UNFPA as an organization, seeks to help women safely deliver children each day. So, as an example, in the large Za'atri refugee camp in Jordan, which I've been to, but UNFPA ran the maternity ward over a period of a few years. 10,000 children were born, without one maternal death. It's remarkable. And that's a program the U.S. used to support, but stopped. And actually, to put a finer point on that, it used to be when a new child was born, there would be a little sticker on the bassinet with a U.S. flag. And think about what a lasting image that was for a new mother. And then when the Trump administration revoked our funding and they removed those stickers. So that's just one example of their work. You asked about impact of cuts. Let's look quickly at Yemen and Venezuela, obviously areas Congress has been focused on. But before 2017, the U.S. had been the second largest donor for UNFPA's emergency response there. The funding was used to help mothers access healthcare, support survivors of gender-based violence. In 2019, after another year of Trump administration withholdings, this fund ran out of money in the middle of the year. And it's in places like these that UNFPA is leading the effort. It's not viable to switch to some other UN entity or other partners. And then finally, just in terms of child marriage, female genital mutilation, one can look at the Central Sahel. Right now, violence between armed groups has forced over 100 health centers to close. And this disruption has been compounded by COVID-19. And as it stands, UNFPA's humanitarian operations there have only received 28% of 27 million that's needed for humanitarian assistance. And this is a region where 90% of women or girls have undergone female genital mutilation. In Niger, which I've been to, about 75% of girls were married before age 18. So it's, our resources could have made a difference. And so we certainly welcome the decision to restore funding because it's desperately needed.
Yes, and I look forward to reintroduction of legislation to allow and support that as well. And I know I only have 20 seconds. Mr. Chair, am I able to ask one more question? Okay, thank you. And thank you. And this is for Mr. Hannum as well, regarding UN peacekeeping operations and the role that, of course, they play in stabilizing the conflict zones. My specific interest is in women and what role and what else can be done with the UN to better integrate women into peacekeeping forces, and how can we as a nation be helpful in supporting those initiatives and efforts and reforms?
Thank you. Yeah, so one, I would just say in peacekeeping in general, I do think it's important to know because there's a lot of talk, understandably on Capitol Hill, about challenges with peacekeeping, but it's important to remember that we now have 2 decades of data that shows that peacekeeping works, it saves lives and shortens conflicts. Across the board, within peacekeeping operations in countries, the UN, there needs to be more women engaged, and this is something the U.S. called for in the Women, Peace, and Security Act. And I will say the UN is actually ahead of some other nations, chiefly the United States, in terms of having women engage. And there's data to show what that means. Women troops often are able to talk more with the kind of local community, get information. So you've seen examples in Liberia is a good example. We've been there, and a number of kind of women contingents, battalions, which make an important difference. But this needs to be increased because, again, the data shows the important benefits that come from it. And I think the Women, Peace and Security Act, which Congress passed, there needs to be an effort using that to increase the numbers both here and within UN missions.
If you permit me to
Yes,
add,
ma'am.
Mr. Chair, I would only just focus on the fact that in areas of conflict, women through gender-based violence suffer the most. They are raping women is a way of acquiring that territory. And this happens in all of the areas of conflict. I have visited and met with women in the Republic of Congo in areas where they can attest to not only this happening outside of the refugee camps where there would be accosted, but also all around in the areas of conflict. So women are not only important as security and peacekeeping force part of that effort, but they are also the ones that are suffering the most. And gender-based violence is something that we absolutely have got to address in the strongest of ways through these institutions. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
I
you. I
see
yield back.
that. Oh yeah, thank you, Ms. Lynn. I see that Representative Issa is on, but his video is not on, and so I'll wait for his video to come on before I call on him. In the meantime, let's start another quick second round. And every time we do a second round, if you have a question, please feel free to ask it. If you don't have a question, don't worry. Sometimes I've been on the dais and they say, "Oh, we're going to do a second round," and then you feel like I got to ask something. If you have a question, please, a question or two, feel free. If not, it's okay. All right. But let me start with mine. And again, when Daryl comes on, I'll jump to him. All right. So I want to start with Ms. McDougall, because I know that you work squarely on these issues. I want to ask a question about how we can use the United Nations and other international organizations to combat a lot of the challenges that we see here domestically. And chief among those, for example, is structural systemic racism in nations. And obviously, while the dynamics in each country vary, the issue of structural racism is not something that is only particular to the United States. We've also spoken about how we make issues like the rights of women, the rights of indigenous, the rights of workers, foreign affairs issues, how the United States can leverage its position in international organizations to press these issues even more. So, we can start with the structural racism issue, but then also consider the other issues. And then Ms. McDougall, if you want to go first, and then we'll open it up.
Okay. Well, I think that it is, it's very important, and it's certainly been very important to people of color in this country to understand that structural racism has a transnational component, and it is everywhere. And that the UN represents an ability to join the forces and the issues on structural racism and come out with solutions that can be offered, suggested, what have you, to all, primarily through the committee that I have sat on and will again, hopefully, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Then there are also certain very useful occasions that have been organized and hosted by the United Nations, like the Durban Third World Conference Against Racism, and the this year, I think, is the 20th anniversary, and there will be a number of gatherings and comments about around that. The UN the U.S. really needs to engage fully and vigorously with all of these efforts. because it states to other nations where there are now a tremendous number of, for example, African descendant populations, that the U.S. is actually on their side. And the U.S. needs to engage with bilaterally with those countries about what we know about racism and solutions, and what we know about the mistakes of trying to create solutions, and foster more exchanges of activist groups, of warriors, of advocates from both countries. We've got, and we recognize to have a tremendous amount of knowledge, certainly a history of centuries of trying to, approach this issue, one of the weightiest in Americans' history, and we're recognized in that regard. So, for instance, the statement that was just led by the U.S. and submitted to the 46th session of the Human Rights Council on countering racism, that was signed on to by 155 countries. No other country could have achieved that. And so I think that what we need to do is to make it as much a part of our foreign policy as our domestic policy. But we have to be honest, and we have to be vigorous in both respects. So I think there are a lot of opportunities that have so far been missed by all administrations. And with leadership such as yourself and Congress, we might be able to do more in that regard.
No, well, thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd only add, since Professor McDougall is well more versed on these issues than I, but just one example, I think, of kind of the importance of some of these global bodies that we talked about, and also our absence being a challenge. But in last year, about a year ago, in the wake of George Floyd's death, and the UN Human Rights Council held a session on systemic racism and police violence, which was particularly important. So again, it's
That's right.
of the council's work, and it adopted a resolution calling for the High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a global report on the issue. And Human Rights Watch, other organizations noted that this resolution was a step in the right direction, but also that it could have gone further. And I think this is an example of where if the U.S. had been there, just in general, when the U.S. is engaged, we can push the narrative. And so I think this is again example why being part of the council, and I would just say there's been a number of comments on the council. I would just think it's important to say that we have now 10 years of data to show that when the U.S. is engaged at the council, that it is much more likely to hold repressive leaders accountable and to push important reforms, whether it be important concepts that we believe in, whether it be LGBT issues, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. So the data is clear. We should be engaged.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, y'all. Thank y'all. I'm going to go now to, looks like Representative Isa's got his camera on and everything, and we drove with him in the car for a minute, and now he's in his office. So, Darryl, please.
Thank you. And I apologize. We all are multitasking, and on the West Coast, I'm afraid we're doing a lot of it. The two categories of questions, and the first one, I think, during the last administration, there was an attempt to partially consolidate our competition to the Belt and Road, with recognizing that you have Exim Bank, TDA, and USAID. You have a series of both in and out of the State Department agencies that are part of foreign development. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not that should go further, if we're going to have a U.S. united ability to bring dollars and U.S. companies and the like into successfully competing to help develop the world against what, I think can only be said China's self-serving development program.
If I may answer that, thank you very much for that very thoughtful question, Congressman. And indeed, China has tried to masquerade its ambitions on Belt and Road by saying that they are fully in support and that they are tantamount to advancing the UN's strategic development goals, which is very much the Bible of UN development these days. So they're under cover of advancing those goals. They're in fact enriching their own infrastructure project around the world. Since we speak of international organizations today, we shouldn't overlook the international financial institutions among them. And China still is represented within those and considered a developing country for the sake of receiving benefits and resources and benefits of the doubt all around. So they played that very well, as I described earlier. They play within the rules and they play them very hard, maybe not within the spirit, but within the letter of the law. And we need to call them out when we think that they are taking advantage of the largesse and goodwill of an international liberal order that's rules-based and that assumes the best in others. I think we discovered that WTO needs a great deal of reform, as well as another organization and thanks to China driving a truck through the WTO, once they were allowed in, they've decided to take that big truck and back it up to the UN and load it up for Beijing. So I quite understand your question, and yes, we need to reevaluate their qualification as a developing country status within the international financial institutions, that we should not be subsidizing this grand scheme of theirs. Thank you.
And Congressman, I might just add one other point there, and I would just say I think there's already a model that we know which works, which is countering Russia during the Cold War, and former President Reagan talked about kind of peace through strength. And so one of the things we need to do, what China has done is invested significantly in economic development, in diplomacy, and the U.S. Only spends about 1% of the federal affairs budget on diplomacy and development. Of course, we need to use our dollars wisely, but during the 1980s, we spent far more as a percentage of GDP on diplomacy and development than we do now. So that's what China is doing. We know it worked, and so we absolutely need to support additional resources for state and USAID to compete.
Well, I agree with that, and we'll continue to push for that. But I want, the question is more narrow. The Chinese intervention around the world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is not a gift. Their programs, their development programs, are much closer to something akin to Exim Bank, leveraged with maybe Trade Development Agency, because they're bringing in their companies, as you know, they're bringing in their own workers even, and they end up in many cases owning these assets. But in all cases, it's not really foreign aid in the sense of any kind of a gift, and that's where they're competing successfully against us. I'll just take one that most people don't think about. If they put in a telephone system in a developing nation, there's no question in anyone's mind that is a conduit of espionage back to Beijing. They have full transparency as to the government and private sector operations as a result. And that's separate from the large bridges, roads, and port projects that most people see, but they work hand in hand, and those programs dwarf all of our programs combined. So, and I don't think the American people are ever going to give $1 trillion in foreign aid. But the question is, can we and should we look at a program, and I'll just call it $1 trillion in potential loans and projects that are self-funding in the long run? Should that be a goal? Because right now, during the last administration, as you know, Exim Bank was effectively shut down, and we were out of even the small amount of competition we've historically done.
If I could,
All right.
Thank you for that
Ms. Mc-
question. If I may proceed with it,
So,
there is no question that China is reaping all the benefits of the last few years of our withdrawal from working in these organizations and in these manners, and has moved forward with its own set of priorities, with its own efforts in trade, and with its own way of getting countries, giving countries support at the response of countries supporting them in their own priorities, such as, for example, when they wanted to head up the internet intellectual property rights organization, they wanted total support. I think we need to remember that working through multilateral organizations such as the World Bank and the regional banks allows us also to be able to work with organizations that are leveraging billions of dollars from the global capital markets. And they are channeling these resources directly to the private sectors of existing developing countries. Part of our role in this work, of course, is to be able to help increase the, if you will, the punching of these multilateral organizations, in spite of the problems that they may have, and not really just rely on member contributions. The global capital markets are the big players in here because we can access enormous resources if we bring them forward. They are part of a world financial system, one that we dominate. And this is one way in which we can avoid thinking about having to put forth $1 trillion investment ourselves. We can work with other countries, and we have the structures. And it's interesting that the IFC at the World Bank or the IDB invest in the International Inter-American Development Bank. If you look at the resources that they're making available, they are one way to counter what China's doing. Second, our trade in the introduction of U.S. companies into the developing world relies on us being present, being at the table, paying our dues, and being able to open the space for them to counter the threat that China is proposing and gaining ground on.
all right, y'all. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ms. Omar, and then we'll go to the ranking member, Maliotakis. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. McDougall, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. I think that a lot of Americans are actually sometimes really shocked when they learn about the number of human rights conventions that the United States is not a party to. In the last Congress, I introduced a resolution calling on the Senate to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We are the only country in the world to not have ratified that convention, and there are many, many others that we haven't done so. What does this do to our credibility on human rights and asking other countries to abide by international obligations when we refuse to ratify these treaties and conventions ourselves?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that it is a gaping hole in our credibility. We cannot, this is a system that actually the U.S., initiated, as I said, through Eleanor Roosevelt. It's our system. But we very quickly decided that for reasons that I don't think most Americans know nor would agree with if they did, that it did not serve all the purposes of structural racism actually in the country at the time that the decision was to not ratify most of these conventions. And as a result, it set up a system that hasn't allowed others through. such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, who could be against that? We're the only ones that seem to be in the world. So, I think that it is a, it is a byproduct of a system in our country that has allowed, that has been created in many ways over a long period of time to protect those states that want to maintain structural rights, first slavery and then structural racism. And so it's created power in the hands of a few. So, and the outcome is that, in situations like the treaty system, which by and large operates in our favor across the board. Why are we not part of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women? What about the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People that was very much modeled after our own widely popular national law? We need a total rethink in a different framework. A different, maybe congressional framework,
Right.
For a decision as to how we enter these other human rights treaty systems.
Yeah. For the rights of the child, it was very fascinating to me because I was in Somalia, which was one of the last 2 countries besides us, and they ratified it in 2016, and I was sent to celebrate that happening. And I remember sitting with our US ambassador who was there cheering this on, and who helped fund, that campaign to make it happen, without us actually realizing that we ourselves have not participated in that. And then I wanted to maybe get your take on something that I think it's a really good idea. I've been pleased to see that the Biden administration is intending on re-engaging with the UN Human Rights Council. I think that's the right thing to do, but the council's detractors have a point, right? A lot of the countries that are a party to have appalling human rights records, and I'm wondering what you think of our engagement and membership on the Human Rights Council to promote human rights.
Well, I'm very much in favor of the Biden administration re-entering the Human Rights Council. It gives us an opportunity, first of all, to listen, to make sure we fully understand all of the arguments around the room, and then to make more informed choices, to form coalitions that we can work with, coalitions of other governments that can maybe create better outcomes. But I tell you, it is truly a dilemma, this question that the UN has had to tussle with for a long time. Do you want the worst outside or inside? Do you want them in another dimension where they cannot hear what you have to say, or to be subject to whatever power you may coalesce against, their practices, etc. I think it's a difficult decision. I think so far the UN has come down on the best possible side of that decision, but it does lend itself to, sometimes uncomfortable, let's say, short-term outcomes.
And thank you, Chairman. I would like to ask, when we do our second round, maybe I'll get an opportunity to ask the other members the same questions.
And can I just 10 seconds, just one point there, Congresswoman, just to say in terms of engagement, what we have found is that countries or adversaries are delighted when we're not part of the organization. They welcome, and that there are examples, most notably Russia in 2016, where we help mobilize countries to block them from joining. So we're much more likely to block countries with terrible track records by being engaged than not.
Chairman, you're muted.
Sorry. I saw Ms. Otero had her hand up, so I'm going to go to her in a second. But after that, we're on our second round, so I'm going to go to Representative Jacobs and then back to Representative Omar, unless somebody else has questions and other representatives. And then we're trying to close by noon Central, or I'm sorry, noon, I guess, Eastern. And so, so I'm don't think me rude, but I may keep people on time as we're answering these questions. Okay. Ms. Otero, your final comment on this question.
Thank you. Actually, my comment was on the previous question, if you permit me, about children. I would say that if the American people had any idea of the conditions in which children live around the world, as they are laborers with incredible levels of exploitation, as they are trafficked for sexual and other things, as they are working in the mines in the Congo and in other places, as they are put in refugee camps. And I've been to Dadaab several times in the Somalian border, and to the Rohingya camps where it's full of children. If we had, there would be enormous outrage, as there was when families were separated from their children in our southern border. The American people, I think, need to have more information about these factors, and we need to make sure that we are able to communicate, because the goodness of the American people, the kindness of their spirit, the values that they give to family and to their own children are factors that we need to be able to demonstrate in the way in which we interact with other countries and in the conventions that we sign and we don't sign. And so I think these are really important concerns that we also need to build into the way in which we project our country's efforts in the rest of the world.
Thank you. No, thank you, Ms. Otero. All right, y'all. So I think our final two questions will be Representative Jacobs and then Representative Omar, and then I'll close. I would just ask everybody to be on the grid view and look at the 5-minute timer for these last two questions, all right, so that we can close on time. Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is for Ms. Otero and Mr. Hannum. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think the most important reforms would be to the UN, whether that's the Security Council reforms that I kind of mentioned in my previous questioning or otherwise. But in terms of really being able to address the kinds of challenges we're facing now, what you think the most impactful reforms might be.
Please, Mr. Hannon, go ahead, since you live and breathe it every day.
Yeah, happy to. And Congressman, let me start, I guess, with an issue I think near and dear to your heart, which is around peace building. I mean, this is something that the Secretary General feels very, very strongly about, because there's just, of course, quite a bit of data about how much, if you can invest in peace building efforts, how much it saves you down the road. The problem is, as we all know, people generally, it's hard to do kind of upstream efforts. It's kind of only when a crisis is coming that there's an impetus to do more. And so I think this is where I think U.S. engagement could be particularly important. And quite honestly, funding. And I mean, again, the data shows how much an investment in peace building would save down the line. But so just looking at 2020, I mean, there's a peace building fund which mobilized about $180 million. But these resources are now depleted and must be finished. So one, of course, that's significant. But in the when we're talking about the 28 trillion that's been lost because of COVID and how that's exacerbated extreme poverty, and you've seen the first increases in 20 plus years, there needs to be more investments along these lines. It's critically important. And then I would also say, just in terms of COVID, can't talk in 2021 without talking about COVID. It's got to be U.S. and others mobilizing support around equitable vaccine distribution. I mean, everyone's talking about vaccines, but also a number of countries. We still need to make sure countries have personal protective equipment and therapeutics. And so there needs to be right now a coalition that comes together. 75 countries haven't even gotten a single dose. We need to come together. The U.S. has begun this, which is welcome, but need to come together and support this. We know the economic returns, but the health and humanitarian reasons are there. So I would say kind of peace building, and then an all hands on deck around COVID.
I would only add to this that, when we think about the UN writ large, and we say, oh my gosh, why should we put any resources in that? It just goes into a black hole and we can't really see them. In fact, these institutions that we've created and that have operated for 40 years or more do need reform. And reform does need resources. And I think it's very important to be able to take each piece of the organizations. For example, if you just use the UN High Commission on Refugees, and you look at what has happened to humanitarian aid, to displaced people, to refugees, just in the last few years, they have grown to be more than 80 million people that are displaced around the world. How can we create reforms in the structure that we use to address humanitarian aid? It begins with the UN. And so my suggestion is that we look at each arm of the UN and we put resources into figuring out the best ways in which we can reform them. And it's easier to do this with those that are delivering services to the vulnerable and to all the populations around the world that need them. It is harder to do this with the UN Security Council, but also necessary. So I think we really need to think about reform as an activity that requires our leadership and resources from everywhere to be able to carry out.
If I may add just briefly on that, this year is the selection of the Secretary General. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to come forward with our vision of the organization, with our need for accountability as a management tool, and with our plans to beef up our team. And to
Mr. Dugan, I have to interrupt you. We're out of time on this question, and I got to keep us on time so that we finish by noon Eastern. But you want to make 5 seconds of closing remarks there on that question?
Yes, just to say that we have a unique opportunity this year with the selection of the Secretary General to broadcast what we expect and what we need from the organization, and to commit our resources to creating a team that understands and works the organization well on the ground. And,
sure. Okay. No, well, thank you. Thank you for those remarks. It looks like Congressman Issa is back on, and he's got you have a question, Daryl, I assume? And I think you're on mute, but Daryl, I'm going to keep everybody to the 5 minutes. So please, panelists and members, watch that 5-minute clock. Let's stick to the 5 minutes. So we'll go with Representative Issa, then Representative Omar, our last questioning, and then I'll close real quick and we'll be done. All right. Representative Issa.
Yeah, I'm trying.
There you go. There you go. There you go.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to follow up on the 80 million figure of refugees and asylum allocation. I don't think that I'd be kidding you if I said that there was an interesting ambiguity going on right now at our southern border. We receive hundreds of thousands of applications for asylum every month from what is disproportionately found after the fact to be economic refugees, people seeking a better life at our southern border. Less than 5% of them will be granted asylum, but that will still dwarf the amount of asylums that were and/or refugee, visas that will be granted to people in those tens of millions of refugee camps around the world. How would you propose that we right-size or rectify the fact that these camps have become places that people don't leave them as a percentage. They are becoming more and more permanent camps. And the world in general is taking, and including the US, is taking a relatively small portion of these refugees, and their former countries are, in many cases, even after conflict, are not taking them back. How would you suggest that we make a major overhaul in what has become a very large and ever-growing problem of permanent refugees and a lack of asylum and refugee allocations by member countries of the UN, us included?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that incredibly complex and important question that I don't know if we can answer fully here. However, let me just add one thing. One is that, for example, if we look at our southern border, the countries that people are coming from are those countries that are the poorest, the ones that offer the least opportunities for people, but are also the ones that are mired in violence and in corruption. So you might think you have an economic refugee, but if that economic refugee is one who in his or in her little place has a tiny little business that then has to pay a weekly amount to someone that is threatening them to do that, or whose child is.
I apologize. I wasn't implying that. I was simply using the ratio that our courts have found of those who come versus those who are granted, and the bigger question, which is these countries do not have, for the most part, those 80 million people that are in refugee camps that are becoming permanent. I'm not disagreeing that we have a problem south of our border and that we need to engage. I'm simply saying that that is getting the focus of the media, both here and around the world. Well, this permanent problem. I visited the camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, and some of them dating back to 1948, others more recent. And as I've seen these grow, I've become concerned that we've gotten good at allocating resources to refugees, but not very good at finding solutions to their status.
Just to add to that, there is no question that one of the reasons that these camps have a protracted presence in them is because conflict continues. Somalia is a perfectly good example. Dadaab camp between Kenya and Somalia is the second largest city in Kenya. However, the Somalians, their country is still in upheaval and have nowhere to be able to go. And so you are right, Congressman, there are then situations, and I have met people in refugee camps that were born in refugee camps, and that have lived and learned what they could there. So I do think that those camps reflect the enormous displacement caused by conflict around the world. And again, this is one of the areas that is so connected to the role that we play in developing countries and in the overall global scene.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Congressman.
I want to thank you. I will just quickly close and say, some of the camps I visited, the Palestinian camps that have been there since the 40s, reflect the fact that it's not about one administration. I do think that this committee needs to take a look at the permanent refugee status around the world and help develop a plan to change that.
No, thank you. Thank you, Congressman Issa. And then our final question by Congresswoman Omar.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Congressman Issa for that question. I and my family sat in a refugee camp in Kenya called Otanga that is closed now for 4 years waiting for asylum. I was one of the very fortunate ones to have gotten that. I did go back in 2016, 2011 to the Somali-Kenyan border and was in Dadaab. And remember seeing young people who were in that Otanga camp with me who did not get to relocate and start and get an opportunity to get asylum elsewhere, but went back into another refugee camp. And they, as I've had children, had an opportunity here in the United States, gotten an education. They have lived in that camp and have had their children in those refugee camps. And so yes, we do have a responsibility and should have a conversation. It was devastating to watch the last 4 years our numbers of admitting refugees dwindle to like 18,000. So I am delighted to hear that we might go up to 125,000. So that is part of our responsibility, and I do hope the congressman will join us in advocating for those increased numbers. But I wanted to go back to Ms. Doggle. Earlier, you mentioned something in regards to racial justice, and I know that a lot of activists in the United States, from Malcolm X to Puerto Rican independent activists, have drawn on the UN system and human rights in their own struggles here at home. What do you see as the relationship between the international community and our struggle for racial justice here?
Well, I think it is first and foremost a continuing inspiration, and it leads people, as it led me to believe when I was young and growing up in Jim Crow South, that out in the international community there are different rules about equality, and as W.B. Du Bois saw the UN, and said this is going to be create new forums for African Americans to plead their case for equality. I think our challenge is to make sure it is that, in fact. And that's why I do the work that I have done with the Racism Committee, Anti-Racism Committee, and as a special rapporteur on minorities around the world. Are we living up to these hopes of being of speaking to and supporting the claims for equality of people, not only Black people in the United States, but minorities around the world? That's our responsibility, and we've got to constantly question if the UN is fit for that purpose.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Omar, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony and to our members of Congress for all of your questions. I'll have just some closing remarks real quick, and then we'll conclude. After today's testimony, it should be clearer than ever to this Congress that international organizations and our participation in them play an indispensable role in advancing American values and defending American interests. We were instrumental in the creation of these institutions of the international order. We must be just as instrumental in leading them to the 21st century. And it's also clear that if we don't, other nations will, to our detriment, and I believe to the detriment of the world. Working through international organizations, even when acting alone might be quicker or more advantageous in the short term, will make our global leadership stronger and more impactful in the long run. And with that, I want to say again, thank you to all of our very distinguished panelists, our witnesses, to the members of Congress who participated. We are adjourned. Thank you all.